Welcome to Week 5, Lecture 2, Humanism and Reform. In some ways, you may be surprised by this title a little bit. And actually, when I was looking at it again, I was like, what did I actually title this lecture, Humanism and Reform, rather than Humanism and Reformation? Because I've stressed in the lectures thus far that there is a distinction between reform and reformation. And so often, historically, scholars have referred to late medieval reform and an early modern reformation, discounting the clear calls for reformation in what I've referred to as the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. And so, in this extent, I'm using the word reform. And you'll see why that is true, or why that is so in any case, as we go through today's lecture. And I'll try to keep this as succinct as I possibly can. Again, if you have questions about it as I go along, anything I say, or would like elaboration or whatever, please just ask. But we'll see how it goes and how far we get. And hopefully this will be a lecture that will help understand what we're getting to when we start getting into the 16th century next week. So, with that being said, this is still the introduction. And the introduction this time has a subtitle or colon subtitle: "The Problem with the Reformation or the Renaissance." The problem with the Renaissance, and the problem is, or I should say, the Renaissance is a problem. So often it's been seen as the beginnings of modernity, together with the Reformation, Renaissance and Reformation, as ushering in a new period in European history. New ideas and cultures and ideas, um, secularism, in terms of actually focusing on human beings, turning away from religion and theology, and the authority of the church, and all these types of things. And that is absolutely not the case. The term the Renaissance was actually devised by the scholar Jakob Burckhardt. He was a Swiss historian in the 19th century, mid 19th century. And he wrote the Renaissance or the Culture of the Renaissance in Italy, like 2 volumes. And it's one of these classic works. The problem is, though, that thereafter, the whole field of Renaissance studies that emerged and developed often took Burckhardt at his word. I mean, it's a brilliant study. It really is. It's a great study in cultural history. It's worth reading. But to my knowledge, no Renaissance scholar today still follows Burckhardt. We've gone beyond that because Burckhardt was writing in this grand scheme in the context of the 19th century. And he saw something in Italy in the 14th and on into the 15th centuries that he claimed was new and was a rebirth, not just a rebirth of classical ideas and models, but a rebirth of the human spirit. He has a famous phrase that the Middle Ages lay in darkness until the veil was lifted by the light of the Renaissance. Now, be that as it may, what I would like to do today is actually look at what is going on, or what was going on during this time period called or termed or categorized as the Renaissance, and what did have to do with Reformation and the relationship between Reform and Reformation in this context, because I think this will help clarify that distinction as well. For me, the Renaissance was a development or a movement within the later Middle Ages. Chronologically, that's certainly the case. It makes to me not a lot of sense to say, okay, we have later Middle Ages from approximately 1300 to 1500, and then we have the Renaissance approximately from 1350 or so to 1603. In any case, if we take it up through England and the English Renaissance, so-called, under Elizabeth I. That's a qualitative designation. If we look at it chronologically, it's going on at the same time. So we have to keep that in mind as well, that the Renaissance was not a thing, but developments within this period chronologically that I'm designating as the later Middle Ages. And we need to be able to look at what was going on and what were the new developments without bringing all the baggage, so to speak, of the interpretation and reading back into those developments based on our sense of what it was all about. So that's why this lecture is called Humanism and Reform rather than Renaissance and Reformation or so. Because however you want to define it, the term humanism um, was very significant for this period in this development. In so many ways is synonymous with the Renaissance itself, but we'll see that as we go along. Now, the point to this, as I think I said, is to try to look at what this was, how it came about, and what impact and effect it had. And if we had to kind of encapsulate the Renaissance, the whole sense of the Renaissance, it would be with the Latin phrase that was used at the time, the return ad fontes, or to the sources, which is the first slide. Now, ad fontes just means to return to the original sources. Now, I have up there the first entry in this slide, the Renaissance in pursuit of classical models. And in many ways, that is the defining characteristic of the Renaissance. It is a rebirth, because that's what Renaissance means, a rebirth of classical models and following classical models. That means we are going to identify ourselves and model ourselves after classical ideals. Now, the study of the classics had always been there. The appeal to the classics had always been there, especially to people like Cicero, Virgil, Seneca, and a number of other classical authors were always part of the established intellectual world. Aristotle certainly was an ancient, and he was very important, needless to say, as I've already discussed in the university curriculum in the high and later Middle Ages. But what they meant by this is that this medieval reading, and this is what I mean, the scholars at the time in Italy to begin with in the 14th century, thought that scholars in the medieval period weren't really reading the original sources of the classical authors. They were reading quotable quotes. They were reading from encyclopedia, from handbooks. They weren't actually reading the sources themselves. It'd be like saying, okay, I can go to what used to be called Butler's Book of Quotations. Now I'm sure you could Google all these quotations online, come up with quotable quotes, throw them in a paper, and you can sound very erudite, but it doesn't mean you've actually read the works, if that makes any sense. And that was the claim against the medieval scholars. Now, some of them certainly were that and did that. They dropped names and everything else, which all scholars do all the time, basically, in many ways. But there were other scholars who did study the original texts, and especially with the translation of Aristotle. We have scholars who were learning Greek and then also Arabic to translate Aristotle into Latin. Now, they were doing that within the context of a scholastic frame of mind, and the humanists, I'll define that term shortly, had a different frame of mind. And that was, let's try to go back and understand it as they were. Now, there was a sense, an historical sense, and this is not just Burckhardt's imposition, but we do find in the sources an awareness or an appeal or a pretense. Now, that is more problematic to discern between those different labels. In the later 14th on into the 15th century of Italian scholars, claiming that they were different, that they were not like the scholars who had come before. They were indeed affecting a return to classical models, and by emphasizing going back to reading the classical texts themselves and their quote-unquote originals, that was the proper method and approach for understanding the tradition of antiquity, of Greece and Rome. Now, primarily it was Latin, but then Greek became very interested in, and Greek studies really took off in Italy in the 15th century, a little bit in the 14th, but then especially in the 15th century, and also the north of the Alps as well, beginning back to that. So this call ad fontes was a return to the classical models, the classical sources, reading them in their originals, and we find the impact of doing so necessitated a new approach to the reading and interpretation of texts. We can, in many ways, see the Renaissance as the beginning of what is called textual scholarship and textual analysis in a more modern sense, quote unquote, more like we do it today, but that didn't really develop until the 19th century. But it begins that here in the Renaissance when scholars start comparing texts, they start textual criticism, correcting faulty copies, for example, and trying to really get at what the classical authors actually wrote. And that tradition has been there in classical scholarship all along. Until we get to the modern critical editions, and I'm not going to go off on criticizing classical studies here and now, but there is an issue, I think, there, depending on how one approaches it. I should say not with classical studies as such, but with a particular approach within classical studies. Because, for one example, a classical scholar has a nice little book, Martin West is his name, textual criticism, talking about how do we handle the manuscripts, the copies of the classical authors. Because indeed, we don't have the autograph, we don't actually have the original manuscripts of the classical authors themselves. We don't have anything that Cicero himself actually wrote. All we have are medieval copies. And so the entire classical tradition basically has been transmitted through medieval manuscripts and medieval copying. And then the question becomes, how do we get back to what Cicero did write when he actually wrote, or what did Virgil actually indeed write when he first wrote it, not just what the copies say? Because there's a development in language, there's a development in orthography of Latin, grammatical Latin, and everything else. And so it gets to be a real problem to say, how do we reconstruct what must have been the text of Cicero or whatever? And that was, West's position. He said the job of the philologist, as it's called, a philologist is someone who studies language and texts to do philology. And he says their job in textual criticism of philologists, producing critical editions, is to reconstruct what the text was as it came from the author's pen. Now, that is problematic on all kinds of levels, and I'm not going to go into the whole theory of textual analysis and interpretation and critical editions and editing. But is that even possible to do that? And I would say absolutely not. And that's what's been pointed out repeatedly, actually. But there are still classicists who have that view. West even went so far to say, if there's a mistake, if Cicero or if Virgil made a mistake, the editor's job is to correct it for them, meaning that we should write what they would have written if they had recognized their own mistake. Now, I'm just going to leave it at that and think, wow, what a statement that would be. That means I know Cicero better than Cicero knew himself. It also means that, my gosh, if they made a mistake, it was a mistake, it wasn't on purpose, and everything else. So I'm going to leave that as a side. But that approach to doing textual scholarship began with the Renaissance. And there are all kinds of other theories and approaches to doing textual scholarship and analysis and critical editions. Besides that, let's say, hardline classical position of reproducing the text of the author as it came from the author's pen. But that's the problem Renaissance scholars faced. They started looking for also manuscripts of complete works, which were not really known. They knew of them, but do we have a complete manuscript? Where can we find them? Where can we find classical texts? Certainly we know a number of them from the medieval tradition, what authors have cited, and what's still available in libraries that we know of, going back to the 14th, 15th century. But do we have a complete set? Do we have the entire text? And how good of a text is it? And so is that approach that these scholars brought about, and that was something new and important, and did have an impact, as I'll be talking about a bit more later. But that's when we get to the issue of studies of textual criticism and language. But here I need to talk a little bit about what humanism means, and there is still debate about that among scholars. Was the term humanism, which, as all isms, was a 19th century German creation, humanismus, turning a descriptive adjective into a substantive noun. We today, it's not talked about a lot, but in the 60s it was, certainly in the 70s and 80s, and still is around, something called secular humanism. And what that term refers to today is basically an atheistic focus on the wonders of humanity and what it means to be a human being. We don't need to appeal to God or religion or anything else. That's all superstition. We're secular. We're of this world, not the next world. And the proper study of humans are human beings. We're wonderful people and we're great people, great animals and all that. And so that humanism is celebrating humanity. Now, I'm not going to comment on that perspective, but that certainly was not the humanism of the Renaissance, of the 14th, 15th, on into the 16th, and perhaps even into the 17th centuries. There were no such thing as what we call modern secular humanists at this time. All the humanists were definitely Christian. They could be critical of the church, as we'll talk about too, critical of traditions, but they were not atheistic. They were secular in that, insofar as that medieval understanding of secular, which I've talked about. They were not members of the clergy. They were in the world, so to speak. So they were within the saeculum, which is a very Augustinian term. And so they were secular in terms of that, in that they were not churchmen by and large. There were some, and I'll talk about this later too, some monks and priests and bishops and so who were definitely humanists, or who were humanistically trained and are supporting humanism, and that will become important too for understanding Calvin in the French context when we get there. But we have to make that clear distinction between what today has been considered to be humanism and Renaissance humanism. And for Renaissance humanism, there still has been a debate. Was it a focus on the human being, or was it something else? Now, we also can talk about humanism, medieval humanism, and I may have mentioned earlier, I'm not sure. But with this whole rise of the Renaissance and Renaissance studies and Renaissance as a field of study, which we certainly see with painting, and the painting techniques of perspective, representations of the human body start becoming very more realistic. Themes being portrayed shift. And so there is certainly, let's say, a Renaissance focused on humanity and the human with respect to the art of the period. But we find humanism, such in the Middle Ages too, both in terms of classical scholarship and in the focus of on human beings. I can only point to the School of Chartres in the 12th century, the Platonism of the School of Chartres, and the focus on humanity, as we can see in Bernard of Sylvestrus's great poem, the Cosmographia. But that would take me too far afield to explain that or to defend that. Sir Richard Southern, a great scholar, wrote 3 books, Scholasticism and Humanism, dealing with medieval humanism and its origins. Well, anyway, in 1926, even before, um, just mentioned his name, Richard Southern, long before Richard Southern was mid to late 20th century, long before Southern. Charles Homer Haskins, a medievalist, American medievalist, wrote his book Renaissance of the 12th Century. And he claimed that so many of these characteristics that Burckhardt described as being the Renaissance, characteristic of the Renaissance, and the whole field of Renaissance studies were focused on, he said, actually, we can trace back to the 12th century. So it all depends on how these things are handled, more than some absolute proclamation of this is medieval and this is Renaissance. It's more of like how were the classical sources of models treated, and were they treated differently and in a new way beginning in the 14th and 15th century? And basically, yes, they were. Now, I have it there this is still on the slide, Alfonte's Textual Criticism of Language. And then the next point there is the Studia Humanitatis, which is a Latin term for the studies of humanity. The Studia Humanitatis. Human studies, or what we would call the humanities. In so many ways, that's what this whole humanist program was in the Renaissance program of education, which I'll be talking about, was a focus on the humanities. Now, if you were a scholar in a medieval university and you taught law. You taught law at the University of Bologna or Oxford. You'd be called a legist because you taught the law. You were someone who taught law. If you were teaching in the Faculty of Arts, you'd be called an artist because you were teaching arts in the Faculty of Arts. So now the point was, if you were teaching the humanities, you would be called a humanist, someone who taught the humanities as subjects. That's where the whole term comes from. And the humanists were teachers of the humanities. And I'll be describing that and defining that for you in more detail shortly. So that's where this whole term comes from. And we need to see it in that context, lest we get carried away by attributing all kinds of ideas and assumptions about it that really weren't there and can't be supported historically. So if we see the humanists as primarily teachers of the humanities, or who were pursuing the program of humanities education, then we have a good historical understanding of what humanism referred to and who the humanists were. So what were the characteristics given that with this humanism and stuff? And there we do see a slight distinction between Italian humanism and then Northern humanism. And Northern humanism here is north, meaning north of the Alps, that which was not Italian. There's been a lot that has been made between this distinction, trying to claim that Italian humanism was very different from Northern humanism. That could maybe, by and large, and there were some differences of emphasis, but there's still a lot of commonality. So that's what I want to look at here. And since I had mentioned going back to the sources, and I already mentioned the language issue up here, the first entry on the slide, Italian humanism and Northern humanism, is Greek, Latin, dash, and Hebrew. Now, why I have that here with the dash is because the Italian humanists focused on Greek and Latin, the classical sources of the ancient tradition, antiquity, classical antiquity. In the North, they also added Hebrew as one of the ancient languages. In the North, humanism and this program of the humanities and study of the humanities and original sources was connected with biblical studies. And to do biblical studies, you needed Hebrew and Greek and Latin. So that I'm not saying that there were no Italian humanists who weren't also interested in biblical things, but by and large, they focused on the classical antiquity, and in some ways the emphasis, not exclusively, but the emphasis of humanism north of the Alps was on Christian antiquity, where you did need Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. And I'll reference that a bit more. Now, again, I have it there in the theology and religion. And it just goes back to my point that I've already made, that the humanists, whether they were biblical Northern humanists, which has also been called Christian humanism, the Christian humanism of the North. Well, the Christian humanism of the North was no more Christian than was the Italian humanism in Italy. It might be a different characteristic and understanding of it, but it was not essentially Christian versus non-Christian, or Christian versus secular, so to speak. I've already referenced that term. But there was a greater emphasis north of the Alps in biblical studies. So that's where that is all about. But if we look at the teaching endeavor and how religion and theology played into this, we have a development in the North, primarily, first of all, in the Netherlands and the lowlands, and then into Germany, called the Devotio Moderna, or the modern devotion. Now, I could have very well spoken about the modern devotion, or the Devotio Moderna, talking about religionization, the pastoral endeavor, and so, or even the new monasticism, because what the modern devotion were groups of lay people who were not ordained, who had decided to follow their own private vow to live a religious life. And there was a faction of these people who even lived together, kind of like in monasteries. They called them houses rather than cloisters or monasteries. They still worked in the world, but they kind of lived together in a common life. So the Devotio Moderna, also known as this monastic, this has been called, or pseudo-monastic branch of it, was called the Brethren and the Brothers and Sisters of the Common Life, the Brethren and the Sisters. I'm not sure what the female term for brethren is, but they lived together in groups and houses. But they still continued their life outside their religious house, so to speak. And one of the things they did there, not completely uniquely, but they would teach students. They would teach students on an elementary level. This was not university level training. This was not even the same level of training as the monastic studia that weren't associated with universities, but that's maybe a longer story. But they gave a basis for taking in students and teaching them Latin, sometimes Greek, literature. That gets back to the curriculum, let's say, of the humanities, which I'll be addressing shortly in a bit. And this is important too, not only because it sought to provide, let's say, a more institutionalized humanistic training and education, but also because Martin Luther somewhat tangentially studied with a community of the Brethren of the Common Life, Brothers of the Common Life, in his early years. But I'll be coming back to that when we get there. And the whole question of Luther I'll be addressing later in this lecture, on the extent to which Luther was a humanist or was not, or what were the influences on him of humanism and all that. But that's where I bring this in here, because of this context of this movement, the modern devotion and the Brothers and Sisters of the Common Life, and the relationship to this new kind of humanities education and what impact that had on developments as we go further. That is why that there is there. Now, maybe I didn't. Did I? I'm just going to go check real quickly to see when do I talk about. Yeah, that's the next slide. The next slide, I'll get into the curriculum, so to speak. So that is one impact or development of this humanism as a descriptive term, describing developments of the focus on humanities and teaching of the humanities and human education. Another development was the rise of what some scholars have referred to as civic humanism and the rise of the Renaissance state. And there I have, after the colon on the slide, the rise of quote unquote patriotism. What was this all about? Now, it's kind of complex. I'll try to keep this quick and easy. Civic humanism, as described originally by the scholar Hans Baron in the 1960s, I think it was. Baron was a German scholar. He fled Hitler, came to the United States, as many actually German scholars did, and he actually worked at the Newberry Library in Chicago. He didn't receive a university position, but he worked for numerous years at the Newberry, which, if you don't know, is still a great center of scholarship for the Renaissance studies, and then some. The Newberry Library. It's a great place to work. I love the Newberry. I haven't spent a lot of time there, but the time I have has been really wonderful. They have a great collection. It's a great place to be. So yeah, but Baron publishes books, Civic Renaissance, or Civic Humanism in Renaissance Italy, I believe it was. And he argued there that in Florence, this great center of the Renaissance in Italy, this return to classical models in terms of the art world, the patronage of artists who were producing realistic portraits. And that's another thing that came into being, a huge shift on portrait painting of princes and patrons, and representations of the human body that were far more anatomically correct than the medieval position. And that was somewhat based on technique. That was also based on choice of style. We have some artists who we have from whom we have paintings in both styles, kind of the medieval style and the Renaissance style. It's not that they were painting in the medieval style and all of a sudden switched. They go back and forth depending on what they want to portray and how they want to portray it. It's an issue, again, of style. Styles change. And it does not necessarily mean that one style is superior to the other, depending on what the criteria are. We can say that Renaissance sculpture, Renaissance portraiture, Renaissance painting is more realistic of the human form than was medieval. But that doesn't mean it is necessarily any artistically any better. But that's a whole other issue in terms of interpreting style. Now, Florence was one of the origins. Some of the first humanists, as they were called, came from Florence. In the late 14th century on into the early 15th century, Baron, or Baron, B-A-R-O-N, I don't want to confuse you by the pronunciation, but Baron noticed that some of the city secretaries were humanistically trained. They're the ones who were involved in diplomacy and governing the city. Florence was a republic, so it did not have a prince. It did not have a king or anybody ruling it. It was ruled by the citizens themselves. And so the figure of the state secretary or chancellor, as they became called to, became very important as kind of the CEO. And Leonardo Bruni was the CEO of Florence in the early 15th century. And he didn't start because his predecessor, Coluccio Salutati, in the late 14th century, kind of started this as being the first kind of humanist chancellor of Florence. But Bruni continued in that tradition. He wrote a classically modeled history of Florence, where he's proclaiming the glories of Florence as a republic. And very much interestingly, going back to Rome, Bruni is the one who claimed that liberty died the first time the word emperor appeared. He didn't look back to the Roman Empire. He looked back to the Roman Republic. And he traced the origins of the Florentines not to the Romans, but to the Etruscans, even earlier than the Romans, so to speak. So it's a fascinating study. It's a fascinating history. And he's writing it in with Cicero as his model. Cicero became the model for all humanist Latin prose, and Virgil became the model for all humanist Latin poetry. Already, Francesco Petrarch, who was working with Florence, but also he was at the papal court. I referenced Petrarch a lecture or so ago in terms of referring to the Avagonese papacy as the Babylonian captivity. Petrarch is often seen as the father of humanism. He actively sought to imitate the classical models. He's the first one to write an epic poem in classical meter, like Virgil, imitating Virgil in his Africanus, Scipio Africanus. Received the laurel. He's the first poet to receive the laurel since classical antiquity. So he's really seen as kicking off this movement, and we'll talk a little bit more about the origins of it later. So Florence had this tradition of looking to independence, Republican independence of their city-state, glorifying their city-state. And Bruni would write speeches praising Florence, just as speeches have been given praising the emperor. I think I mentioned maybe Augustine when he was named the official rhetor or the teacher of rhetoric in Milan. He had to give speeches glorifying the emperor. So this was a tension in different models, even though both were from antiquity. Milan, up in the north, who were led by a prince, they, of course, appealed to the Roman Empire as the model. So we have this clash continuing in the Italian Renaissance in the later 14th on into the 15th century between imperial Rome and republican Rome. And the city-states that were ruled by a prince looked to imperial Rome, and the city-states that were republics looked to republican Rome. The classical models were common. And Bruni fuses this idea of devotion to your city, which is the state, devotion to the city and the state, going back to that original classical idea of what does it mean to be pious? It means devotion to the gods, to the state, and to your family. And that elevation of the state almost as a religious entity almost. That's why I call it the kind of the origins. I say the origins of patriotism. I say, yeah, the rise of patriot. I say the rise of patriotism, depending on what we mean by patriotism. To be a patriot means to be a devoted, faithful servant of your state. And we see that with Florence, the pride of being Florentine as opposed to being, Milanese, as opposed to being Nepalese, as opposed to being Babylonianese from Bologna. They started having this sense of we are Florence. We're a city-state, we're free. Now, I referred to the imperial free cities and the communes previously. There was some of that there, too. The sense of we are free, independent states. And we're great. That just kind of explodes in Italy in the later 14th, early into the 15th century. So we identify kind of this humanist program put into the service, a public service of the city-state. That's kind of what civic humanism is in a nutshell. And to explain it in any more depth would take us too far afield. But that's also a part of what has been identified as the Renaissance state. So it's not just civic humanism, it's also this concept of the Renaissance state, which had been different from the principalities and things of medieval Christendom, even though, in my view, it's still part of medieval Christendom at this point. The Renaissance state was coming from Burckhardt, but a lot of more research has taken up this insight of Burckhardt's and developed it much further. Burckhardt has it called the art of the state, or the art of politics. And what he saw there was that what was going on is this new men, as he called it, the new men, has been seen as coming up in Italy. And these were people who were not from well-established families. They're not from dynastic families. And the inheritance patterns we see with emperors and kings and such were all based on family ties and primogeniture, handing things down to your firstborn. Whereas in Italy, we see people coming from no background, no noble background, seizing power. Now, it has been theorized by David Herlihy, a scholar too, Fisher Brown, later I think at Princeton, but anyway, David Herlihy argued that really what made this all possible was the Black Death. If you remember with the Black Death, Europe lost at least a third of its population in aggregate, and in Florence has been estimated up to 80%. That offered great opportunity. All of a sudden, positions are open. The opportunity to seize power and rise to power and assert power is there. And these new men who didn't come from established families, who weren't being based on blood and the bloodline of rule and leadership, but on their talent, on their ability and effectiveness to actually seize power and lead the state to greater glory, so to speak. And that Renaissance state idea of this is a creation that we can create. It's not a given that is inherited and passed down that we have to take care of and preserve. It is something that we can make new ourselves. That concept of the state, when I say the state here, again, I'm talking about the city-states in Italy. This didn't really apply to the empire as such. Didn't apply to the Kingdom of France as such, or to the King of England as such. But to the city-states in Italy, it kind of did. They'd always kind of been independent, and they still are very close to that classical heritage and background from which they came. So that concept of this new approach to political organization, political dealings, and the function of the state for the people and how it can be a work of art and be a creation itself by these new men without ties to the past, without ties to bloodline and inheritance, seized on this idea of the humanist program and patriotism to create something new, a new development there in Italy. Now, some of this could lead to indeed a focus on humanity and how wonderful humans are or could be, and often used as the prime example of this view of humanism, not humanism meaning not as the teaching of the humanities as such, but rather this focus on humanity and on the glories of being human, was the early 15th century, I believe Florentine, humanist, Pico della Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man. And free will. And free will is not part of the topic, but I'll get back to that, or not part of the title. I'll get back to that later. Now, you can see Oration on the Dignity of Man, definitely not using inclusive language. We'll come back to that issue later here. But what Pico actually argued was this. Everything in creation, everything God created, has its natural state and its natural nature. And everything in the God created, except for human beings, can't be anything else. A tree can only be a tree. A dog can only be a dog. A lion can only be a lion. So it's just their nature that lions eat lambs. Sorry, that's just them being themselves as God created them to be. Humans, however, humans have an indeterminate nature. So human beings can rise to the level just below the angels, or they can descend to the level of the demons. Now, for him, that was not simply a characteristic or a metaphor, or even a simile. It was saying that the angelic being is a fundamentally different type of being with a different nature. And a demon actually was an angel that fell. He said, what humans, their indeterminacy is they're not one place. It's not just saying that humans can only be human. That's just part of their nature. No, it is their ability to determine their own nature. Because it's not a given. And how they do that is with the use of their free will. And I think we all know individuals, probably, I'm assuming, who we say they're almost angelic, really good people. And I think we also know people or know of people, both sides, who are so vile that basically they're evil, they're demonic. Most people are somewhere in between. Might kind of tend towards one or the other. I know one person, actually, my doctoral advisor, Heiko Obermann, to me I couldn't believe it that he was both at the same time, angelic and demonic. And it was sometimes kind of strange, even if painful, to see those two sides conflicting with themselves or also present at the same time. But that's a whole nother story. But that is what Pico's arguing. He's not saying that humans are this great thing that we should celebrate. He's saying that the dignity of human beings is their indeterminate nature, and that humans can determine their own nature by how they live their lives, by their use of their free will. Now, that is an emphasis that we find in general with humanism and with the humanist program in the humanities, is the use of free will. The human beings have free will. And we'll come back to that debate later on, because that will raise its head with the debate between Luther and Erasmus in the 16th century. That use of free will was an issue with Augustine and Pelagius. That distinction with free will is the basis of, or the denial of free will is the basis of the Augustinian view of predestination. Even though Augustine would say, I hold to predestination, but I do not deny free will, because somehow that free will is the sense of what makes humans humans. And Pico would say definitely free will is what makes us humans, but that means we can be up on the scale, at all points of the scale, from the angels to the demons. Now, what do we do then if we want to persuade people more towards the angelic side than the demonic side? Persuasion becomes very important for the humanist program, for the humanities, and for the Renaissance as such, in many ways. Now, rhetoric, up there I have the art of persuasion. Rhetoric is that. Aristotle wrote a treatise on rhetoric. There have been classical rhetoric. There have been medieval rhetoric. Rhetoric was never simply mere rhetoric, as sometimes it has been critiqued as. It was how to use words effectively. How do you persuade someone? If we think about it, Cicero was a statesman. He was also a scholar and a philosopher. As a statesman, he was working in the Senate. He was a lawyer. What do lawyers have to do? They have to persuade a jury. In classical times, they had to persuade the Senate because the Senate was the jury. The better you are with language, the more likely you will have an ability to persuade. That art of persuasion, that art of rhetoric was taught, was studied. They would study classical models of speech giving, Cicero's orations, to try to say, how can we be most effective? And that then led to this general principle among the humanists: it is better to do the good than to know the truth. What good is the truth if we don't pursue it? I may know it, but I might not follow it. And here I often say, okay, how many, to my students when I'm teaching this, how many of you do things that you know are not good for you, but you know they're not good for you and you consciously do them anyway? And if anybody, I should say, if anybody doesn't raise their hand, not everybody raises their hand, I said, say those of you who are not raising your hand, you're lying. Or you're just not wanting to say. I'm not going to ask you what those things are. We all do that. We eat things we know are not good for us. We drink too much we know is not good for us. We do all kinds of things we know are not good for us. And we do it anyway. We know the truth and we don't do it. But if we could persuade people just to do the good, that would work better. That would work better. Is there truth behind laws? Maybe, maybe not, depending on what we mean by truth and how that all fits together. But you can know what the laws are and not follow them. If you say that's a stupid law, fine, but society won't work very well if everyone says, I'm not following that because that's a stupid law. We need to be able to persuade people to be good citizens, to contribute to the common good of the state or the city-state. That was this concept of this art of persuasion, as well as the legal origins of it. And as we transition then to the next point there on the slide, the rise of diplomacy, princely court, civil governments, and the papal court. Persuasion is also the art of diplomacy. Because diplomacy is an ambassador going to another state and saying, okay, this is what we want. Can you do for us? Or we want you to stop doing this. We have to persuade you. And the other party will kind of try to persuade us of doing something else. That whole negotiation process is the art of persuasion. If you can use language so effectively that you can persuade diplomatically your counterparts, you're going to be a very effective diplomat. Still today, it's all about persuasion. And sometimes you have to try to use force. That's part of persuasion. If you say, if you don't stop, invading your neighbors, we're going to come and invade you, and we have, the means to back it up. You can do that in different ways. You can put it forward to them in different ways. You can put them off and say, no, screw you. We're going to continue doing what they're doing. But if you can get them to see the problems with what they're doing and put it in their own best interest, you can persuade them to stop doing something. That's in everybody's best interest. So the sense of a conscious art of diplomacy in conjunction with the rise of patriotism, the humanist program, civic humanism, based on the classical models, because what were the classical models? Literature, law, ethics, politics. Those are the ones that became the basic curriculum, which I still will get to a bit more context in the next slide, that led to this humanist program that led to the rise of diplomacy, the rise of the new men seeking legitimacy for their positions and persuading people that they were the ones to best fit to rule. And princely courts, civil governments, and even the papal court all realized the value of having good diplomats, of having the value of humanist trained scholars at their courts. So they would hire humanists to work for them. And as diplomats, as speech writers, as historians to uphold the grandeur of the ruling family, to uphold the grandeur of the city-state, or the papacy, the papal court. And so we have this patronage, which I referred to in the last lecture or so in terms of coming out of the university. But this was a non-university training at this time. We'll come back to that too. This was the humanist program and humanist studies, the Studia Humanitatis, were not part of the university, explicitly not. It was outside the universities, but still offered a career path and a very lucrative one. Two, if you could be hired at the papal court, if you could be hired at the princely court or the city court, if you could become chancellor of Florence, that's a very nice position to have. If you could be working for the King of France, that's a very nice position to have. If you could be working for the Pope, that's a very nice position to have. And they all employed humanists, increasingly so. That is the importance, and also why both north of the Alps and south of the Alps, humanism became a major thing in terms of the art of rhetoric, the humanist program, the art of persuasion to make it all work, as the politics of the time become increasingly problematic, which I'll get to as well later too. But then finally, we have to ask if this was a renaissance and a rebirth of classical models and everything, did women have a renaissance? Or was this still strictly for upper class, wealthy men? Joan Kelly, in 1976, I think, published her famous article, Did Women Have a Renaissance? And essentially argued, no, they didn't. Women are aristocratic, noble women. Some of them were trained in humanism. They were trained as showpieces, basically. So if you were a prince and if your queen can recite Cicero, can recite Virgil, can name drop classical sources, that showed how magnificent you were. It didn't affect the common people, males or females, that much. But even for the aristocracy and nobility, by and large, it didn't change the status of women. Even if some women did receive a humanist education, but again, they did so as kind of a showpiece. Look at my great wife. Look at what she can do. Isn't that clever? So that's about what I want to say there. We just have to keep in mind that this movement, this program, was not for everybody. It was not elevating the educational levels of society. It was not including them whatsoever. It was not even saying that they were on the same level as men. The oration on the dignity of man was just that, on males, not on females. Females almost had their own nature determined for them, almost, because they were seen in Aristotelian terms as undeveloped males. But that gets into a whole other issue. But that's what we're working with too. It's important too as we get into the 16th century because there were very powerful, very influential women. To do say Queen Elizabeth of England was one of the outstanding monarchs ever to have lived. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, was an extremely influential and powerful woman at the time. There's always been women who had been very influential and powerful, but as individuals in particular circumstances and somewhat unique circumstances, and not as an opportunity that women could aspire to. Essentially, at this time, women could be wives, they could be daughters, they could enter a monastery and become nuns, or they could be prostitutes. That was about it. And we'll see that again a bit. I think I'll get to it when we get to the 16th century and the Reformation. And how that has been argued that was actually a repressive movement for women because it sought to make women either wives, directly subject either to their husbands or fathers, or prostitutes. Because the monasteries they got rid of, prostitutes also they tried to get rid of, and so the options for women in the Reformation became simply wives. That was another issue, but we'll get there when we get there. But I wanted to pose that question just now because, again, when we talk about the Renaissance, we always think of this rebirth of flowering and wonderful culture, and isn't this great, and focus on humanity, but it's not for everybody, and it wasn't for everybody. It was for the upper crust, the aristocracy, the nobility, and overwhelmingly for males. Now, that being said, putting the Renaissance, therefore, humanism in context. We look at the relationship between humanism, the humanities program, university reform, and reformation. And on this slide, I have up here too the non-university origins of humanism. And as I already mentioned, indeed, humanism developed not in the university. The universities in the late 13th and the 14th and still in the 15th century, beginning to change though. The curriculum was based on Aristotle, as I said, on the liberal arts, which were not the humanities. The liberal arts consisted of dialectic, um, dialectic, grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. Rhetoric was taught, but rhetoric of Aristotle was taught. And then astronomy, music, geometry, and arithmetic. 4 mathematical subjects and 3 linguistic subjects, but more in a philosophical sense of how does language work. Grammar was not grammar in terms of subject verb agreement, or don't have dangling participles and things. It was how do the parts of speech relate. What does the verb is mean when we have it joining together or copulating? That's what it's called, the copula. The verb to be is the copula, joining subject and predicate. What does it mean that A is B? That we'll see later on. And that's a philosophical discussion because it gets into being. So it wasn't that. With the humanist program, though, I have up there the new subjects: poetry, literature, history, and ethics. The focus was on language as use and on literature, so that grammar became the study of literature as it was in antiquity, as it was still for Augustine of Hippo. Grammar was the study of literature and poetry. I mean, I have those as two distinct things, but poetry is literature. Literature, history, and ethics. That's how we learn to do the good. That's how we learn to be patriotic. That's how we learn to seek the levels of dignity right below the angels. That's what we can aspire to be more than what we think we are at this moment. Now, it's been debated differently. The origins of humanism have been debated, but Petrarch said the father of humanism, but he didn't kind of spring out of nothing. And we see early on in the late 13th century among, again, scribes and princely courts and city states and city courts and city governments beginning to try to use rhetoric for their letter writing, for their diplomacy, and looking to classical models, and that kind of develops out of that. So, and then also an increased use in vernacular, but that's another issue. Latin is still overwhelmingly the primary source, but we do begin to see the rise of vernacular literature. It had been there before. There's vernacular literature in the Middle Ages, but the attempt to develop national literature kind of begins in the Renaissance. So it's not just that you're using Old French, but you're using Old French to write the history of France, the Chronicles of France. I mean, Froissart is north of the Alps, and people would claim he's not really a humanist, but he writes his chronicles in Old French. And there's other things. We have Dante, who writes in Italian, Boccaccio, who writes in Italian as well as Latin. Petrarch wrote in both Latin and Italian. So we have this rise of this linguistic, cultural, political sense of patriotism by a focus on language and using classical models of education and classical models of language to do so. Now, the humanists were also kind of fun, just as an aside. They also realized that if we're going to follow classical models, we also should follow classical handwriting, because this handwriting is so bad. I think I've mentioned this before. If not, I should have. If we look at the development of handwriting, the handwriting in the universities, especially not in the official texts made for presentation copies and things, but just the general texts and lectures, are very difficult to read. Now, the humanists also looked at the architecture, thought the architecture is horrible. How many of you have seen or been to or seen a Gothic cathedral? We call it Gothic cathedral. I think personally they're beautiful. I think most people think they're beautiful. But where does that name Gothic come from? It was the humanists, the Italian humanists' denigration of medieval architecture and art. They said, this is horrific. This is downright Gothic, i.e., Gothic from the Goths. Who was the Germanic tribe that sacked Rome? The Goths. So it was seen in their view as this was what destroyed classical Roman culture. And this Gothic term was applied to the art and was also applied to the handwriting. The handwriting was seen as Gothic. So we have to go back and copy Roman models. And they developed what's called the humanist script, what's labeled the humanist script of writing. And funnily enough, it wasn't classical models that they followed, but actually Carolingian models from the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries. They were copying Carolingian minuscule, which itself was a copy of Roman half uncial. So it was a derivative, but it just shows that these Renaissance scholars were not all knowing, and they were also filled with pretense. They thought they were a lot more knowledgeable than they were. They thought they were a lot more erudite than they were. I'm not trying to denigrate their erudition or their scholarship. It was a fantastic achievement, but there's also this bombast that went with it. And so often historians have accepted that bombast, also coming from Burckhardt and his bombast, as the actual historical developments. That's what we need to distinguish between. Now, the importance of focusing on language study, on the development of language, could have significant impact. I'm just going to point to two here quickly because I know I'm beginning to run out of time. The first is Lorenzo Valla's refutation of the donation of Constantine. Lorenzo Valla was an Italian humanist, and there was a document known as the Donation of Constantine. I may have mentioned it before. It supposedly was what Constantine gave to Pope Sylvester when Constantine moved to Constantinople in 330. His city, Constantinople. Well, he granted, according to this document, Pope Sylvester, the jurisdiction over the western part of the empire. So it gave the Pope temporal jurisdiction over the western part of the empire, Italy, north of the Alps, and so. Yeah. Point one. This document was a forgery. We know that now. Done approximately in the mid-8th century, Carolingian scholars. It was rarely ever appealed to by either the emperor or the pope. In the conflicts between Marsilius of Padua and Augustinus of Ancona, and I said that Augustinus clearly, in my view, knew Marsilius's Defensor Pacis very well. He doesn't cite him, so he's not directly replying to him. But both argue that if the donation was valid, it doesn't really mean much. Marsilius does not appeal to the donation of Constantine except to say, if it was valid, it shows that the church, the western part of the empire, was actually under the emperor's control. Augustinus says, if the document is valid, what it shows is that actually Constantine was the first real Christian emperor because he recognized the right to rule of the Pope. So he's actually giving back. He's the first legitimate ruler because he returned rulership to the papacy. But the point, again, so much has been made of modern scholars. I'll tell you why. We'll get that when we get into next week's lectures, because Luther thought this was an amazing thing when he read that this was a forgery. Lorenzo Valla, in the 1430s, writes this refutation based on philology, a philological analysis of the development of language. And he claims that the document could not have been written at the time of Constantine in the early 4th century CE, but was probably to be dated sometime in the 8th century, which is where scholars date it today. Now, Lorenzo Valla, this was before the time of print, so printing had still not been developed yet. He circulated it among his humanist circle friends, and they read it and probably chuckled and had a good one on you, Lorenzo. You said this whole thing is a joke. Good job. You've done your work well, because this shows the impact of humanist scholarship, what it can have. Now, again, we'll come back to that next week in terms of the impact of that. But at the time, it didn't have great impact. It would, as we'll see next week, or the week after, I forget which, anyway, shortly. The other is actually jumping up to the 15th century or 16th century, is Erasmus of Rotterdam's Novum Instrumentum. Now, Erasmus was known as the Prince of the Humanists north of the Alps, but he also worked in Italy and traveled around. Seeking patronage, being offered patronage. Technically, he was an Augustinian canon, not a hermit, a canon. But he was a scholar. Basically, he's a scholar. And we'll get back to that because, as I mentioned, you'll see on the slide there, Luther and Erasmus and free will, which I'll discuss briefly. Erasmus felt that, the New Testament, actually the whole Bible, he started with the New Testament, needed a new translation. And so he translated the Bible from Greek into Latin and had it published and printed in 1516. He wanted to improve on Jerome. The Latin translation, the Vulgate as it was known and still is known, was a translation into Latin by Jerome, St. Jerome, who was a great classical scholar. Well, as Erasmus was saying, he might have been a great classical scholar, but not good enough, and I'm better. And a new translation. Very controversial. Just for one little example, I may have already mentioned this at some point. I don't remember when exactly. I'm sorry. I'll mention it again. The beginning of John's Gospel. In principio erat verbum. That was Jerome's translation. In the beginning was the Word. That word verbum, like our word, the Word, capital W, had a lot of metaphysical connotations. It was central for the doctrine of the Trinity and everything else. I won't go into all of that. It was translation of the Greek logos. But Erasmus said, no, it's not that. Logos doesn't mean this metaphysical word, the Word. It means just a spoken word. So he translated the opening of John's Gospel not as in principio erat verbum, but as in principiat erat sermo. Sermo is a good word for a word, basis of our word sermon, which is a speech, a word. And that was his whole point. And he even defended it theologically by saying, you know what? How did God create everything? By speaking. Deus dixit. God saw that it was good and said it was good. Let there be light. Deus dixit. God spoke. And what is spoken is a sermo, not a verbum. But that was a challenge all the way through. Now, it has been argued that, and I'll come back to Luther as a humanist, that Luther had a copy of it because it was Greek and Latin side by side. Not too long thereafter, other Bibles were being printed that did not have new translations, but they would have the Greek, the Latin, the vernacular translation, and maybe even some others as well. The Complutensian Polyglot Bible in Seville, I think it was definitely in Spain somewhere, was part of that. So this was a whole process of biblical scholarship and applying humanist techniques, humanist methods, humanist skills to biblical scholarship, saying that we need to basically work on the text of the Bible if we're going to have the basis for true theology. That's the basis for it. Now, we'll come back to that maybe later in terms of the impact of those, but that's just two examples where philology, kind of nerdy, very specialized, arcane scholarship, had huge impacts. We kind of have forgotten those things. But with this whole development of this humanist program, we have the rise too in the north, in this Italy too, but primarily in the north of these humanist circles, sodalitates as they were called, where you'd have people getting together who were like-minded, studying the classes, discussing kind of like reading groups, but reading classical literature, reading what the other scholars, classical scholars, were reading and working on and publishing. And so it was like these small groups. They'd have their meetings and get together and talk about classical literature, talk about the importance of classical literature for biblical studies or whatever it might be, and also talk about the importance of reforming the church. The humanists in general were for reform. They wanted to make things better. Erasmus argued viscerally for reform. We need to improve. We need to clean things up. He did not follow Luther. He did not claim that the church needed reformation. You can say, well, does the anonymous author of the Reformation, the Emperor Sigismund, claim that the church needs reformation? I would say, yes, he does, actually. And others, scholars are too. Was the observant movement calls for Reformation, introducing Reformation, a call for reforming, or simply to make things better? And I would say, by and large, it is for a reformation of the religious life in keeping with the observance. So that distinction is important because there were humanists who did become reformers and who did advocate the Reformation and who did follow Luther. One of the big ones, and very important for the whole movement, was Philip Melanchthon, Wittenberg's new professor of Greek, Philip Melanchthon, who came to Wittenberg in 1518. There's a whole story behind that. He was an outstanding scholar and became Luther's right-hand man. And we'll hear more about Melanchthon as we go through. But this whole approach to the humanist program and the focus on free will was to come into conflict with Luther's theology and his approach explicitly with Erasmus. When Luther and Erasmus got into an argument over free will, Erasmus had written a treatise on free will, and Luther had written one on the bondage of the will, De Servio Arbitrio, very bombastically arguing against free will. And we'll see that too next week in his theses against scholastic theology, disputation theses against scholastic theology. And Philip Melanchthon kind of intervened because he knew Erasmus, who was on fairly close terms with Erasmus, and he was by this time Luther's right-hand man, supporting Luther in what he was doing. And Luther had a different style. Now that brings us to the question of, was Luther a humanist? I was like, well, no. It would be difficult to argue that he was a humanist. He had some elementary humanist training with the Brethren of the Common Life, but only tangentially. His knowledge of Greek was not to the level of Melanchthon's at all, and Luther would admit that very clearly. It had been assumed that Luther, when he did his own translation of the Bible into German in 1522, there in the Wartburg, which we'll get back to that he used Erasmus's Novum Instrumentum, but other scholars have come and shown no, actually, he used the Vulgate. He was translating right from the Vulgate. He had maybe Erasmus there, but he didn't really know what he wanted to use Erasmus. It's not really a product of biblical scholarship. Luther's translation is an amazing achievement, regardless of what you think about Luther for the German language. It's an amazing achievement, just as the King James translation for English was an amazing achievement. But we can't say it was an outstanding piece of biblical scholarship based on philological sophistication. And the Greek, it was based on the Vulgate. But anyway, that's so many other ways. He was aware, certainly, of humanist scholarship. And in the treatises and disputes with Erasmus, it's clear that Luther knew what he was talking about. He just came from a different background and style. Erasmus is this polished humanism with classical rhetoric, can be very bitter and biting. Classical allusions, Luther knew the allusions. He just didn't use them himself, or he turned them around, and at times he's still using his scholastic Latin to argue against Erasmus, and also we'll see that Luther could be very crude and vulgar at times, and Melanchthon even had to apologize to Erasmus for Luther's language and things. But there's little question that Luther was influenced by humanism. He was a big supporter of Melanchthon all the way through. He was instrumental on getting him to Wittenberg to begin with. And we cannot claim that humanism had no importance, especially when we come to see that the reformation of the universities and the calls for curricular reform began to be increasing, and Luther supported those. And what was the Reformation in the university context? The introduction of the humanist program and curriculum into the university. It was only in the 1560s, I forget exactly when in 1560, I have to look it up, that we have the first chair in poetry in a German university. I think it was in Heidelberg. Again, I'll have to go back and look it up. So there is this attempt to change the university curriculum and to introduce subjects such as literature, history, ethics, politics into the university curriculum to kind of fuse this scholastic curriculum and to transform it with a new humanist curriculum. And that was what was going on at Wittenberg. That was why they decided to say, we are going to hire a new professor of Greek. And they brought in this Wunderkind, so to speak. Philip Schwarzerd was his name. Schwarzerd in German means Melanchthon in Greek. So Philip Schwarzerd changed his name to the Greek version, Melanchthon, or what we say Melanchthon, as he became known thereafter. He was the nephew of one of the great 15th century German humanists and Hebrew scholars, Reuchlin, and they had thought actually they wanted to get Reuchlin to come to Wittenberg, but he declined. But said, "What about my nephew? He's fantastic," and that's whom they hired. And the Reformation, Luther's Reformation, as it was to develop, would have been extremely different without Melanchthon. And in so many ways, the whole development of Lutheranism would have been different without Melanchthon. I'm not trying to say that he had a bigger influence on Lutheranism than did Luther, but he had a very significant one. And he and Luther working together with a team that we'll be looking at when we get into the Wittenberg theology and then further development of the movement there in Wittenberg and beyond. Now, the crisis of education. I haven't mentioned crisis yet in this lecture, I don't believe. But I have been talking about this late medieval crisis. And so, was the Renaissance part of this crisis? It seems hard to think of the Renaissance as a crisis, even if it was coming out of a crisis, even if the new men taking their opportunity after the population decline and the plague were central to the Renaissance. What do I mean a crisis? Well, as I said, this was a movement outside the university. It was a movement that was a new movement. It was a development that challenged the assumptions of what education should be and could be, and what being educated should be and could be, as well as challenging the concept of what a state is and could be. I'm not going to quite say if we just took this on its own, I might not say that humanism was a crisis of education, but it caused a lot of debate. It caused a lot of conflict. And it's all changed us. We've gone through curriculum revisions here, and actually the history department is going through one right now that I'm part of on the committee, and it can be kind of bitter, it can be contentious. What do we do? How do we go about doing it? Do we resist the new, or do we throw out the old? How do we fuse it? And it leads to an undermining of the assumption that we have it right. How do we teach? What's the goal of teaching? What's the goal of educating? And to what purpose and to what goal? I can say a lot more about that if we were doing the Renaissance. Of course, in the Renaissance, I would continue along those lines. And of course, this lecture would be not just a single lecture, but an entire course. But in instead of that, we don't have the luxury of doing 3 or 4 courses just to get at one, namely the Reformation. I had to treat it all in a single lecture. And in that sense, that's why I want you to see that number one, this new development, this new educational program of humanism focused on the languages and north of the Alps, especially in the biblical languages, um, implicitly was a critique. And when we start critiquing what has been, it can be a crisis. And in the context of all the other developments that we have seen over the last 5 weeks now, um, it contributed to the crisis. It's like, where's the last place that we have to stand that isn't like shifting under our feet? Well, we have the university. Not anymore, because that is shifting under our feet. How do we change? What do we do? How do we understand things? And that all leads up to beginning next week with Luther himself, whom you will know, I hope, if you've begun to read the Luther and the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, that for me, this is not a new departure, that Luther is a continuation of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages and maybe the culmination thereof. And we have been leading up to this point as that culmination, and then there'll be a transformation after Luther kind of gets going, so to speak. But first, we turn next week to Luther, his early years in development, and how he represents and deviates from this late medieval Reformation, Reformation of the later Middle Ages, yet still in the sense of crisis and urgency. Thank you very much, and I'll see you again soon.